And so with that, Whit, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Annie. And Annie's going to get a shout out a little bit later, but she was one of my first friends here when I moved to Grand Junction. So I'm not going to jump into the video quite yet, or the presentation quite yet. I'm actually going to start with a video. So let me share my screen really quick. And what I wanted to show you all was, let's see if this will let me get out of here. Maybe it won't let me do that. Maybe I'm showing all this. Here we go. All right, so this is a video that I took about a year ago, actually. This was the first time that I got to see a Gunnison Sage-grouse lek, and I'll talk about what those words mean if you don't know. But just brace yourself for a very shaky video because I was very cold, very excited. So that is a video I took when I was in Gunnison proper. I had met a Bureau of Land Management biologist. Her name's Kathy. And I very much wanted to see sage-grouse lek for the first time. So she said she'd take me out. And we were actually driving up the road. So you have to leave up about 4 a.m. You want to be there before sunrise to get to the lek area. So we're driving up a road, and it turns out they're lekking in the middle of the road, which is what my background photo is also. So we were late to our lek count, but we had one of the most special experiences being about 10 feet away from the birds. Hopefully, if you don't know much about sage-grouse, these words are going to make sense by the end of the presentation. But so yeah, I wanted to talk to you all about the Gunnison sage-grouse, which is my species of expertise. I'm a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, working in Grand Junction, Colorado. Been with the bird for about 1.5 years, and it very quickly has become my favorite bird. And I'm a birder, so it took a little bit, but it really is one of the most special birds, especially if you live on the western slope. Hopefully you find some more interest in it after the presentation today. So I'm going to start with some background about the species. If you have some birding background, you might have heard of the greater sage-grouse. So the greater sage-grouse is a more common, more frequent bird, also found in Colorado, but found throughout the western United States in the sagebrush ecosystem. So if you can see my map there, that northern area, the green area, that is the greater sage-grouse population of western Colorado. And then that purple area on the map is the Gunnison sage-grouse population in western Colorado. It's also found in a small area near Monticello, Utah, but predominantly it is in Gunnison, the largest polygon there, and then sporadically throughout some other areas in western and southwestern Colorado. So one thing that I think is important for you to take away from this is the difference between the two species, the greater sage-grouse and the Gunnison sage-grouse. So just a brief overview of the bird itself. So there on the left, we have the Gunnison sage-grouse, and on the right is the greater sage-grouse. Pretty similar. They both have those lekking bubbles that you can see on the Gunnison sage-grouse on the left. The greater has that also. That's not the difference that I want to pinpoint. There is these differences. So if you see, these are the tail feathers. So if you're not a birder, kind of similar to a male peacock or a turkey. This is their breeding plumage. And if you see those wing on the tail feathers, there's bars, and they're lateral and organized on the Gunnison sage-grouse and more sporadic on the greater sage-grouse. And then another thing to note is this funky hairdo. The Gunnison sage-grouse has phyllo-plumes, are what they're called. A lot more of them, almost making like a serious ponytail. I kind of have one myself, inspired by them. And then the greater sage-grouse has those, but way less frequently. So those are two ways that you could tell them apart, but there's a way easier way to tell them apart, which is that there's no overlap in their range. So looking back at this map, we like to say that the Colorado River is a really good geographic separation between the species. So now focusing just on our bird, Gunnison sage-grouse. This map on the right will show you the 7 populations of Gunnison sage-grouse that we have. As I mentioned, 6 of them are in western Colorado, and 1 of them is just over the border in Monticello, Utah. So for folks, if you're attending from Grand Junction, you can see it on the map there. Pinyon Mesa, that's up in Glade Park. That's just south of the Colorado National Monument, and really close to one of Annie's NCAs, the McInnes Canyon. And then over, you can see Crawford population, if you're calling in from Montrose, maybe. That's the north rim of the Black Canyon National Park, and really close to the Gunnison Gorge NCA. And that's actually its own area of critical environmental concern, or ACEC, on BLM land. And then the other populations, there's the Gunnison Basin. That's where about 80 to 90% of the birds live, hence the namesake of the bird. And then Sarah Summit, Cimarron, Sims, if you're familiar with the area, driving on 50 from Montrose to Gunnison, that's where you hit Sarah Summit and Sims or Cimarron. There's some birds found there. Far to the east is Poncha Pass, south of Salida. There's a few birds there. And then sporadically in San Miguel County, we have some birds in the San Miguel population. And then over in Dove Creek on the Colorado side of that Utah border, down in the southwest portion of the population. So just wanted to pinpoint again that when I said that title of the presentation, the listed bird in our backyard, we have some Gunnison sage-grouse really close to us here up on Pinyon Mesa, predominantly on private land. But for me, it's just cool to know every time I look up above the monument that there's some Gunnison sage-grouse up there looking down at me. So I am not going to go too much into biology today, but I did want to give y'all some background that's important for management, which is what I'm going to be focusing on. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a background on the life stages of the bird. So these are the different pieces of its life within a year that different birds will be going through, and the way that they are using the sagebrush ecosystem during those times. So if you see that big picture I've got right there, all those tiny little black dots on there are male Gunnison sage-grouse. So that's a hilltop of a sagebrush hill. You can see all the sagebrush on the slope of it, but it's barren at the top. And this is what I was referencing earlier when I said a lek. So a lek site is this barren area void of sagebrush. This is where they'll congregate starting actually just about yesterday, about a week ago. Not that they do it on the dot, but we say about March 15th to May 15th is when Gunnison sage-grouse birds will, the males will be lekking. And lekking is that dance that I showed you at the very beginning. So that's their mating ritual. They make that popping sound and do those movements to attract females so that they can breed. One thing that's really important for this is they want to be able to be seen by the females, but they also want to be able to avoid predators. So they're always going to be pretty close to some sagebrush that they can blend in with and hide in. So that was that lekking period from March 15th to May 15th. Next, we have the nesting and early brood rearing period. So most of the females after breeding will nest within about 1 mile to 3 miles of this lek. So they'll nest underneath sagebrush, and they will hopefully be able to successfully hatch some chicks. And this is what one of those chicks looks like. And there's a very specific habitat type within the sagebrush ecosystem that they need during this period of their life. And that's the wet meadow area. So if you see, we've got a large tract of sagebrush right here, and then there in the middle is that really luscious green watery area. That's the wet meadow area. And this is what we consider to be the bottleneck area of Gunnison sage-grouse habitat. So we know that there have been some changes over the last 100, 200 years to the way that the ecosystem looks. And one of those changes is a lack of this area. So this provides essential nutrition for chicks when they're at their youngest and at their most vulnerable. They're not able to eat sagebrush yet, so they rely a lot on forbs and insects. And this is the area where we can find those. So with a lack of this habitat means a lack of survival of those chicks. And we think this might be seriously contributing to the decline of the species and the low numbers that we have currently. And then one other life stage worth pointing out, well, next we have late brood rearing period. We call that around July 15th, and this is the point in which we think that the chicks are able to successfully evade predators, fly, move around. They're juveniles at this point, so they're a lot better at making sure that they don't get eaten. And then we go into the fall and the winter period. And the winter period is when they're eating almost exclusively sagebrush, burrowing in the snow to protect themselves, and get some thermal cover and roost in compact snow areas, eating basically only sagebrush during that time. So it's pretty cool imagining, when you look at sagebrush, if you don't know much about it, you're kind of like, okay, that's just a lot of bushes right there. But the more that you interact, walk around, the more you realize there's a lot going on in the sagebrush sea, as we call it, and these different micro habitats that the sage grouse evolved next to and relies to within a single year at different points of the year, and how crucial each of those parts of the ecosystem are. So with that, I want to walk us into the less exciting, kind of more upsetting part of the talk, but this is really important to the species, and it's the status currently. So I work for Fish and Wildlife Service. We are the administrators of the Endangered Species Act, and the Gunnison Sage-grouse was listed under the Endangered Species Act in 2014. I came on in 2021 and started working on recovery implementation. So there's a lot of factors contributing to the current population, and I'll go into those threats and some of the actions about them, but I wanted to briefly show you kind of what we're looking at right now and what's been happening over the last 20 years or so. So if you look up top, this blue line, that's just Gunnison Basin. That is that one of the 7 populations, the largest one where most of the birds are. And if you can see the black line above it, that's the entire population. That's where most of the birds are coming from, is Gunnison Basin. And they follow very similar lines of decline and increase. So we know that sage grouse follow cycles of increased and decreased population growth, but to the extreme decline that they've seen, numbering, as you can see, at the highest, not even at 6,000, and at the lowest, 2,500. These declines over the last 100 years have become even more and more significant. One thing worth mentioning is the lack of studying that was done on this bird up until around the year 1998. Hence how you can see that the first let count, the first population estimate, was in 1998. So something really cool happened then that also resulted in a lot of stress. But basically, a very awesome professor at Western Colorado University, Jessica Young, and some other Colorado Parks and Wildlife biologists realized that the birds that they were seeing in Gunnison were a lot different than the other greater sage grouse that they were seeing in the rest of the United States. And those differences that I explained earlier in the presentation helped them to realize, along with some genetic sampling, that these were 2 distinct species. So as soon as they realized that, around 1998 was when it clicked with them that the numbers of these birds, which were different than greater sage grouse, were in serious decline. So that resulted in Colorado Parks and Wildlife initiating what we do every spring from March 15th to May 15th, which are the high male count estimates during our let counts. So that's what I was doing when I showed you that video, was going out with a let counter very early in the morning, trying to find a good place to hide near the lek where we know it exists, get our spotting scope out, go take a look, see how many males we can count, and report that data to CPW so that we can make an estimate of the total population. So this is done across the range in each of the populations. You can see that Gunnison, in 2022, we had a pretty good year. Most of the satellite populations had a good year too. But you see that heavy decline between about 2016 to 2020, and that's when Western Colorado was experiencing serious drought. So that drought, we think, was contributing to a lack of the resources that the sage grouse chicks and adults needed to survive, along with some other factors that I'll get into in a little bit. So with that said, Gunnison Basin itself, steady enough, sitting around 3,000 birds. total population around 3,500 right now. But what's of serious concern is those satellite populations. So I call them satellite populations. Those are all of the other populations that aren't Gunnison. And those are crucial to the genetic diversity of the species. So if you think about if an extreme event were to happen in Gunnison and wipe out a portion of the population, and we're left with a, less genetically diverse or a very genetically similar group of birds that are very small, and they're going to grow to replace that population. What we would rather have is them interacting with birds from the satellite populations that have a different genetic makeup than they do, so that we can maintain some genetic diversity, so that they're adapted to different issues, different ways that the ecosystem might change. So when we're looking at somewhere further in Southwest Colorado, we're in a more arid environment. Those birds have small, subtle differences in the way that they're adapted to survive than the birds in Gunnison do. So if we can maintain that genetic diversity by making sure that these satellite populations don't blink out, we're protecting the birds in Gunnison. So some of those populations rebounded pretty well in 2021 and 2022. Some of them unfortunately blinked out over the last 5 to 10 years. So one thing that's being considered long-term is translocation of birds from Gunnison into those satellite populations, so we can have them interacting and breeding with each other, getting some semblance of genetic diversity in the satellite populations, and hopefully boosting those populations so that long-term we can have them interacting with each other more. So with that, and with, kind of the alarmingly low numbers that contributed to the listing of the species, I want to talk about the specific threats to the species. So there are a lot of them, but I wanted to highlight some of the main ones, some that I think of as most important and that most of my partners across Western Colorado think of as important. And the first one is cheatgrass. So if you're in Western Colorado and you've driven on 70 over to the Utah border by like Rabbit Valley, you've probably seen these dense fields of golden cheatgrass. So these are dramatically changing the fire regime in places like the Great Basin in Nevada. So they are heavy igniters, they are a fuel. So they are increasing wildfire frequency and they are burning the sagebrush around them. So when we lose that sagebrush, that takes about 20 to 30 years if we can get it to grow back, whereas the cheatgrass will grow right back afterwards. So we're left with dense thickets of just cheatgrass and we've lost our sagebrush. So this is less of a threat in Gunnison right now than it is to the greater sage-grouse population in the Great Basin area. But it's of serious concern to us that this might be the trend based on changes to the ecosystem and changes to our climate that we could be moving towards. So hoping to aggressively combat the ecosystem type change that we've seen others experience. Next is infrastructure development. So Western Colorado is growing rapidly. Places like Gunnison, Grand Junction, Durango, and the communities surrounding there are in a lot more need of power than we were previously. And that's resulting in human infrastructure that's going into the sagebrush ecosystem. And we are noticing that birds avoid those areas. So looking at ways that we can consider those changes to the way that we live and the needs that we have and how we can try to mitigate and combat some of those issues that are reducing the sage-grouse population. Next up here is an erosion gully. So this is in a wet meadow area that I was describing earlier, and historic agricultural and grazing practices may result in something like this. So if you can imagine, over 100 years, we have cattle grazing straight through the middle of this low point in the valley, that, the easiest point of access and the easiest route for cattle to take. Over time, that is compacting the soil there. And then as rain events occur, this is washing and eroding the way that sediment. So instead of a wet meadow area sourcing itself as a sort of pond or like a settling area that water stays in for an extended period of time and grows that lush grass that we saw in that previous photo, it's going straight to the middle, the lowest point, and it's washing away that sediment and not letting any water be held so that we can have grass and forb retention and insects stay in that area longer. And then next we have recreation. So the way that we're interacting with our public land is changing and has changed a lot from COVID and before COVID. So we're seeing a lot more recreation activity. So trails going up, more people getting outside, which is a great thing. But this is just a rapid change that land managers need to be able to understand, assess, mitigate, and conserve important areas for birds. So what is the way, where are the places that we want people to be going, and how do we want them to be interacting with birds, or the places that the Gunnison sage-grouse lives, and how can we make sure that we're conserving necessary habitat for the species while acknowledging that people want to be using public lands to recreate. And then lastly is the common raven. So I don't know if anyone here went to the Banff Film Festival and saw the video of the desert tortoise and the biologist working hard to protect it. We have a very similar story here in Western Colorado, where over the last 20 years, from anecdotally to scientifically proven, ravens are predating on Gunnison sage-grouse eggs and chicks in that early brood rearing period. So they're an incredibly intelligent bird. They're a corvid. So if you've ever heard of those studies where they can recognize 100 faces or can use basic tools, they've followed biologists in the field to find where nests are. They're incredibly smart and they are well adapted to human changes and the human subsidies that we put in the sage-grouse ecosystem. So open sources of water, carcasses from roadkill or livestock carcasses, increased trash in certain areas are increasing the populations of ravens, and allowing them to get closer proximity and in higher numbers to Gunnison sage-grouse, making an artificial increase in the amount of predation of Gunnison sage-grouse without some of the controls that we might have had previously. So looking at ways that we want to appropriately interact with ravens and try to disrupt this cycle of them reducing sage-grouse chick numbers and thus reducing the sage-grouse population. So those are some of the threats, and now I'm going to hop in and talk a little bit about some of the actions that I and others across Gunnison and Western Colorado are taking to combat these. So the first one that I'd like to talk about is a pretty exciting recent development in the last year that me and about 25 partners in Gunnison Basin went in on together, and that was funding a cheatgrass coordinator for Gunnison Basin. So a lot of folks had been talking for a long time about the threat of cheatgrass and what that would mean to Gunnison and how that could reshape the entire area. And we were able to secure funding to hire a cheatgrass coordinator who's now working hard to get projects on the ground and start treating cheatgrass in different ways. We're looking at herbicide use, natural means, pulling, and then a lot of early prevention. So we call it kind of like hold the line. We don't have a lot of cheatgrass right now there, so let's keep it that way. And what are the tools that we can use to keep it that way? And that has a lot to do with that recreation interface and how folks are bringing in potentially seeds from other areas. Say, I go hike in Grand Junction and I'm in that cheatgrass field in Rabbit Valley. What are the ways that land managers can put resources out so someone scrapes their boots off before they go out and start hiking in Gunnison, or a wash station for their mountain bike to make sure they're not letting seeds take a ride with them when they go to Hartman Rocks in Gunnison and are getting into sage-grouse habitat. Next is seasonal closures. And this one's made me a little bit of a villain to my friends that like to go mountain biking in Gunnison, because we've restricted access to certain areas during certain times of the year when the Gunnison sage-grouse is especially sensitive. And I think over time, some of our nonprofit partners have done a really good job of communicating the importance of these closures. So for example, Gunnison Trails is one of my partners, and they put out really good information and resources about why it's important that we abide by these closures and what this means for a bird that is unique to our backyard and how we can protect it by following those closures. So if you're ever in Gunnison sage-grouse habitat, you might see a sign maybe on the north rim of the Black Canyon National Park, saying that we're closed to dispersed camping until after July 15th. And that's because with all the added pressures that we aren't able to control, one thing hopefully that we can try to control is human interaction with those birds during that time period, reducing that and making sure that we wait until after July 15th, and folks can camp then in certain areas, and offering them alternative places to camp nearby that are outside of sage-grouse habitat. Next, we have sagebrush planting. So this one is actually on BLM land, really close to the Colorado National Monument near Knowles Canyon. There was a burn in 2019 called the Cedar Burn, and this was a partnered effort with CCA, BLM, Forest Service, and we went out and we planted sagebrush seedling saplings to return sagebrush to these areas that were burned and lost their sagebrush. And so about 2 years later now, things are hopefully looking pretty good up there. And this is a tool that we're hoping to use elsewhere in places that might have been treated to remove sagebrush historically, that we would like to get sagebrush in if their ecological site is still compatible for that. And then next we have grazing management. So this is an exclosure so that we can do some effective grazing monitoring. This one's in Crawford, that North Rim Black Canyon. And we're working with ranchers to make sure that we are implementing effective grazing management strategies. So looking at specific thresholds of drought and ways that we might shift our use of cattle and sheep, make them avoid certain pastures during certain times of year to make sure that that essential grass and forb cover is there when the sage-grouse needs it, while also acknowledging the lifestyle and the work of ranchers and their use of these public lands, making sure that these can be compatible acts with each other by doing effective monitoring and adaptive management and being partnership focused. Next is a little bit of a brag. I'm pretty excited about this one. Me and those same partners that were able to fund Gunnison County, we got a total of $1 million just about last year from the bipartisan infrastructure law to do projects in Gunnison Basin with wet meadow work, which I'll talk about here in a minute, and that cheatgrass work and sagebrush restoration. And then with that, we were also able to get some science acquisition resources for a tool with USGS to do habitat prioritization to decide where are the areas where we'll get the most bang for our buck range wide to do some of these restoration projects and make sure that we're conserving and improving Gunnison sage-grouse habitat as most effectively as we can. Next is the Grand Mesa, Uncompahgre, and Gunnison Forest Plan revision, which is currently up in its draft form and was seeking public comment previously, and will do so when the final draft is submitted and available online. So if these are your public lands, so I would suggest getting plugged in on that if that's something you're interested in, if you've used any of those national forests or not, taking a look at that plan. I'm working hard with some Forest Service staff to make sure that we include measures in there that are good for the conservation of Gunnison sage-grouse where it overlaps with Forest Service land. And in that same vein is Bureau of Land Management doing a very similar action, which is a resource management plan amendment specific to Gunnison sage-grouse. That's going on right now, also seeking public comment. So if that's something you're interested in as well, if you use Bureau of Land Management lands and are passionate or interested in Gunnison sage-grouse, that would be something I would suggest checking out. I'd say that land managers take those public comments very seriously, and they get addressed, and in ways that we can, when I work with them, well, in my case for Gunnison sage-grouse specific, we try to consider and engage with suggestions that our partners make. And then lastly is the role and the act that funds my job basically, which is the Endangered Species Act. So a good chunk of my job is doing some of that mitigation and control of the way that federal lands are used and how they can be protected to conserve endangered species. So Gunnison sage-grouse listed as threatened. I have a federal nexus is what we call it, to use the Endangered Species Act to make sure that any projects that are either on public land or funded through federal dollars are compatible and able to either mitigate their impacts to Gunnison sage-grouse or have conservation measures so that they don't impact Gunnison sage-grouse. So we've been working hard to make sure that some of those necessary development projects either entirely avoid Gunnison sage-grouse habitat, or when they can't, we implement appropriate measures so that they have the least impact as possible, and continuing to do that with partners. So one specific action that I really wanted to do a deep dive in on is that wet meadow restoration. And that is the type of work that I see as the most bang for our buck and the low-hanging fruit. So that is where we're trying to bring back, restore, and protect those wet meadow areas that seem to be a bottleneck for the species. So really quick, if you see there's Annie. Annie came out to the Gunnison Basin, Miller Ranch, and camped out with me over our Labor Day weekend and lifted some heavy rocks and built some awesome structures with me. And she got to see some Gunnison sage-grouse with me. So I'd say a perfect weekend. So what these structures are, we call them Z-dike structures. But they've been around for thousands of years. And some of them, their names are adopted from indigenous folks in modern day New Mexico and Arizona. But essentially, these are low technology structures that don't require a lot of continued interaction. They can be placed on the landscape and they can change the way that the hydrology and the ecology is working. So what me and Annie are standing on is a one rock dam. And what this is if you can imagine, flow is going down kind of where me and Annie are standing. And this would be in maybe a flash event or in a specific type of event, infrequent precipitation. So water is going to move sediment down through there. The sediment gets trapped in those rocks. That sediment stays moist longer than it would have if the rock wasn't there. And that allows some grasses and forbs to grow back in and above that area. And this is holding water longer for us in those high elevation areas and that upper watershed areas before it moves into the rivers and down out of Colorado. So it's just holding it there a little bit longer so that we can get a little bit more resources back to our area. So there's a few different ways that we do this, a few different types of structures. This one that I just popped up is a Zuni bowl. So this stops something called a head cut. So if you've ever seen like a massive erosion gully or one of those, little tiny canyons that's in a relatively flat area, and then suddenly it becomes this giant pocket void of its sediment, that's a head cut. And those over time expand and they can get massive. And in a place like this where we don't want that to exist, we put these rocks in, they stabilize that head cut, and then they stay stationary. The water stays there, stays put, and we get some grasses and forbs growing back and some retention of some of that water for longer. This is a wicker weir. So we've adopted different types of structures for different areas that have different frequencies of water. So in this kind of area, what we're looking at is an area that doesn't get as much water or at a high frequency. So just a little bit of ability to hold it stationary for longer. So if you imagine a little bit of sheet flow, a little bit of water going over that, it's just going to stay put a little bit longer, hold some sediment behind it a little bit longer. And that's going to allow some of that moisture to regrow some of that vegetation that was lost. So this area wasn't supposed to look like all that dirt around it. It was supposed to have grass there, and we're trying to get that back. And it's low tech. We cut these willow branches from that area and brought these posts in. So it's low expense, relatively low labor, and a good return in restoring that wet meadow area. Here's another one rock dam, same story, trying to hold that sediment upstream, get it rushing through. These are larger boulders, so this is an area that might get higher frequency and higher volume water coming through it. And these boulders are able to, stop that water long enough. They'll stay put. They're really keyed in. You can ask Annie. It was kind of like doing Tetris, making sure that we get these boulders to stay stationary, not shaking or moving around when water is going to come through them. But the same thing, just trying to hold water longer in these wet meadow areas, and eventually expand these wet meadow areas where sagebrush might have encroached on them as they became more and more arid. Here's another example of a Zuni bowl freshly put in. This one's up on Pinyon Mesa. So you see that, and hopefully when I go back up there this next summer, some more sediment has gotten in there and we've even got some vegetation growing back. These are pretty fast acting, and because they're so low tech, they're easily adapted. So if we see maybe improper installation, it's pretty easy to remedy that or to make adjustments or even further improvements to the structure on a year-by-year basis to get some of that sediment back. Here's me proving that I do field work really quick. But what this one is a berm, and essentially what we're doing is we're protecting on a layback an area that might have been hitting water on the side of a shelf, really eroding that area, and we want it to stay put and stop doing that, and hopefully get some sediment getting back in that area and stopping it and moving the water. Instead of going straight in the way that it would have wanted to go, it's going to deflect, take a little bit longer, act more of as a stream like it should than a canal. So towards the end of this, I wanted to talk about the why, and that's kind of why is it important to save this bird specifically, and why are we investing resources and so much time in one specific bird? And for me, it's a really easy answer because I love this bird and I think just by itself it's worth saving, but there are a lot of bonuses and a lot of other cool things that come with us focusing on this bird. And that's all of the other birds and animals that rely on this ecosystem. So we call these sagebrush obligate species. And by having the Gunnison sage-grouse listed, it's offering we are offering not only the Gunnison sage-grouse protection under the ESA, but all of the other species that interact with the environment in the same way are also protected. So here we've got a little horny toad that I saw down in San Miguel County, some poor wills that I saw over in Crawford. We've got a sagebrush sparrow nest that I saw in Gunnison and a sage thrasher that I saw in Gunnison. And there's a whole slew of other species. I just wanted to show some of my field picks, but we've got things like pronghorns and pygmy rabbits that also rely heavily on this ecosystem that are also protected when we protect Gunnison sage-grouse. And then with that is the protection of sagebrush itself and how vital sagebrush is to Western Colorado, but also to our country. So we know that sagebrush offers or acts as a carbon sink, meaning that it is taking in more carbon from the atmosphere than is being put out in other areas. So when we have large stands of sagebrush, we are doing some filtration and some air quality, and we are reducing impacts of carbon in the atmosphere. And then also it's a filtration system for water, like you saw with those wet meadow areas earlier. We are filtering and we are cleaning water at high elevation areas after there's been rain, and we are filtering. So not only are we protecting the sage-grouse, other sagebrush obligate species, sagebrush ecosystem, we're protecting ourselves when we protect Gunnison sage-grouse. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was the why for me. And that's the community-based conservation that I've seen in Gunnison and across Western Colorado. I met one of my best friends, Annie, because of Gunnison sage-grouse, and a lot of my other friends I've met because of the species. But there's a really passionate community here across Western Colorado that cares deeply for this bird and is willing to take creative action, work hard, and be passionate about the bird to try to save it. Even when there's so much stress from the numbers that we see, the ability to go out, work together, accomplish some restoration projects, and enjoy ourselves says a lot about what I think that this community thinks about the bird, and the value that it has, and how cool it is that we have it and that we want to keep it around. So I've got two kind of funny pictures in here that I wanted to highlight really quick. So that first one, this one down in the middle here, we've got a snowmobile right here and an ATV with some snow tracks on it. And they are both about 1.5 feet submerged in some melted snow. And that was up on Pinyon Mesa. This was after a let count. Things just melted off really quickly. So I ended up getting stuck up there for an extra 2 to 3 hours with some CPW folks, and we're just trying to pull ourselves out. It was just pretty funny to think about it, knowing that the sage-grouse were probably standing about 20 feet away from us, watching us look like fools trying to get ourselves out. But it could have been pretty miserable, but it was a pretty cool experience because we'd seen some sage grouse that morning, and we did get out. And then this last one, that's a sage grouse pellet. This is actually one of my favorite photos, which is pretty funny because that's like literally sage grouse poop. But so the story here is I was at Ute Mountain Ute tribe. They're down in Southwest Colorado. They own a ranch, Pinecrest Ranch in Gunnison Basin, that has sage grouse on it. And I was able to meet with their ranch manager there. And one of his workers who was living on site at the time when I got introduced to him was like, "Oh yeah, sage grouse. Yep, I see them on my doorstep every day." And I don't know what bird he's talking about, but surely that's not a Gunnison sage grouse. But sure enough, we went. He lives in a little cabin in the middle of a really beautiful area, and right on his doorstep, right there, was a sage grouse pellet. This guy gets to wake up to sage grouse every morning, and I'm pretty jealous of that. But it's been cool to make some really, really cool partners and friends along the way, and I'm going to continue to do so. And I hope you see some inspiration in here and some excitement. And if you're able and interested, jump in on one of our volunteer opportunities. Hoping to make more of those available over the next few years, so that we can build on this community and get more folks excited about the cool bird that we have in our backyard. And that's all I got today. And I'm happy to take some questions, but thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Whit. That was such a great presentation. Even as someone who gets to hear you talk about sage grouse, honestly, all the time, I learned a lot. And I think it's so important to also share that why, not only why you are doing this work, but why it should be important to our communities to protect this bird and their habitat. As far as a plug for volunteering, I can tell everyone here that CCA, Colorado Canyons Association, hosts an annual event for National Public Lands Day, which is usually somewhere around the 20th of September, I believe. And so we do a couple events, one in each of the NCAs oftentimes, but for the Gunnison Gorge, we have a lop and scatter event where we are cutting down pinyon and junipers that are encroaching on that sagebrush habitat. It takes place in Crawford on the east side of the Gunnison Gorge. And this year, Whit is actually going to be participating in that and helping to share some knowledge while we're out there on the land. So we do, I believe, actually have a date in mind for that, but it will get publicized closer to September. So if you're interested in that, keep your ears peeled for when we announce that event. I've participated in years past, and it's a lot of fun. We cover a lot of ground and do some good work improving that habitat. So we have time for questions now, and it looks like we already got a few. One of them is, to what extent do the agencies seeking public comment listen to people who do not live in the immediate area? Would comments from, say, the Midwest be helpful?
Yeah, they would. It's your public land, even if you don't live on it. And, a lot of the environmental groups that make good comments for us are based in DC, and they get informed local knowledge from other people that live in those areas. So comments welcome from anyone about the way that we're prioritizing our land, and the fact that Gunnison sage-grouse, if you see it as such, should be a priority in the way that we decide to manage our land, would definitely be welcome from BLM Forest Service, and I would definitely welcome them.
Great. We have some questions as well about, so volunteer opportunities. How do you staff the labor for these fieldwork events? Do you publish a schedule at the beginning of the season? How could more people get involved? So I shared that opportunity with Colorado Canyons Association. Another thing that Whit mentioned was that sagebrush planting we did. So we did a series of events, I believe that was in 2021, or maybe it was the following year. I'm sorry, everyone. But we hosted a series of events where we were planting sagebrush on that burn scar. And so with events through our organization, Colorado Canyons Association, if you sign up to volunteer, you will be signed up to receive a monthly newsletter, not actually monthly, a quarterly or so newsletter about volunteer opportunities. You can also check our website for community events and volunteer events. to learn about what we're hosting. Whit, do you have other organizations to share or other ways to learn about, for example, like the let counts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let counts, sometimes we'll seek volunteers, but those are pretty difficult to get into. There's a Juanita Watchable Wildlife Area in Gunnison that folks come from around the country to see Gunnison sage-grouse out. If you look that up online, Juanita, Waunita, and then I can maybe send that to Annie afterwards if that's something folks are interested. That's a way to be able to see Gunnison sage-grouse in a safe and conservation friendly way. And then another group that's based in Gunnison, so working in the Gunnison Basin, is High Country Conservation Advocates, and they put on sage-grouse events that are wonderful, and work with the species there, and doing similar work with wet meadow restoration and with cheatgrass eradication. Cheatgrass pull days are what they call them, and I'd be happy to share a link to them. But we've got some great CCA events here.
Yeah. That is what we have so far as questions. If anybody has additional questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A box or the chat. We have some more time tonight. I have a question, Whit. Have you ever had the chance to see any baby sage-grouse?
So I've seen juveniles. I've seen them at like, after that July 15th period. I think I've seen them the end of July. So by then they're able to fly and they're a little bit bigger. Never seen any chicks. I'd love to at some point, but I don't know. We kind of avoid going out where they are during that time. So it would have to be, I'd need a really good reason to do it. And that might come up at some point, but for now I'll just look at photos.
Give it another minute, and if anybody is typing questions, I'll ask another one. When we were out doing that volunteer project in the Gunnison area, building those structures, and as we were moving across the landscape, I remember we ended up scaring a couple of grouse that were, in the meadow. Is there anything to, do about that? Like if you do happen to stumble upon an animal, any certain way you should act?
Yeah.
I mean, in that case, I know oftentimes the answer would be stay on the trail you're meant to stay on. We were crossing a landscape since we were building some of those structures, and that kind of, the whole point was not to be on a trail. But if you happen to be in a situation like that, do you have any tips on just the best way to respect that wildlife?
Yeah, definitely. I would say, yeah, stick to the trail. But if you see that you flushed them, so when you're flushing the bird, that's when it flies. If you see where it lands, maybe don't walk that direction if you can avoid walking that direction. So anytime we flush a bird, it's expending energy that it didn't need to. And so that's why those let counts, it's really important for us to, keep our distance. We have really strategic areas where we're counting them to make sure that we're not forcing them to move and expend, precious energy that they're spending a lot of time getting through eating. So I would say try to avoid when you can, and then follow those rules about, or those guidelines about, closures. If you see that a trail is closed, and not just for Gunnison, but if there's another species that a trail is closed for, it's probably for that very similar reason. It's in a really sensitive time period in its life. And it just needs to save as much energy as it can, and flying away from us isn't helping it. And then, when we saw them, it was in September. So we had already crossed that threshold. We were in late brood rearing, almost in fall period. They're late stage juveniles at this point. So they're, they have to fly. They have to avoid predators. That happens. Us reducing the amount of time that we were in there, leaving it to one specific weekend that we were working there, was also helping the species. So we were kind of in and out, we're there for 3 days, but after that, we're not going back. And folks were avoiding it prior to that too, just doing a little bit of staging. But yeah, if you see a bird, I'd say don't follow it. Admire it as it flies away and be glad that you saw it, and then try to leave it alone if you can.
Nice. Yeah, something we teach in our education programs is the rule of thumb. If you can cover something with your thumb, you're probably a safe distance from it.
Nice.
We have a few questions, some good questions coming in. One is, can you explain the purpose of that fencing area in working with ranchers, the exclosures, I believe?
Yeah, the exclosure. So what that tells us is, and this is one of a few different methods that we use. So the exclosure protects that grass and forb from being foraged on by either, wild ungulates like elk or deer, and by the livestock themselves that are using that pasture. So say we turn out with a rancher cattle into a certain allotment, a certain fenced area. We put one of those fences in that area so that they're not grazing on it. And then we can make a comparison between the grass that didn't get touched in that exclosure and the grass outside of it. And that tells us utilization. And utilization is the percentage of grass or forbs that were eaten by livestock. And that tells us how much we're working that land. And if there's really enough percentage wise left behind for sage grouse to either forage on or to seek cover within. And we've got some good science that says a little bit of information about how much we think sage grouse need. So that's kind of our indicator that tells us how much we've allowed cattle to be in certain areas within a pasture, and if we might be getting close to that threshold of impacting the sage grouse.
Great, yeah. Another question, did the presentation at Banff Film Festival give you ideas on how to manage raven issues?
Yeah, so that was really fun. The guy was definitely a little how should I say it? Not a fed. He was definitely taking matters into his own hands a little bit. So one thing he used was green lasers, and he pointed them at the ravens, and apparently they don't like them, and they will avoid that area for like an extended period of time after a green laser pointer is pointed at them. So I'd love to see the science there, because I think it would be super fun to do that myself. Just go walk around and laser point at ravens. And then another way, and this is one that I actually really like, and I think that we are considering seriously implementing in sage grouse habitat, is raven egg oiling. So backing up a little bit, we are currently monitoring and counting raven densities in sage grouse habitat. So using robust protocol to confirm that there are more ravens than historically, and in high numbers that may be impacting Gunnison sage-grouse. And with that information, justifying actions against the ravens, one of which is egg oiling. So when you oil the eggs, they are sprayed or painted with an oil-based solution that basically suffocates the egg so that it doesn't hatch. But the difference between this and destroying the nest is that the ravens will stay with that nest through the breeding season, anticipating it to hatch, and it never does. So that puts them out for a breeding season, and that over time reduces the population. And then one of the other ways that the guy was using was he created fake turtle shells, and they sprayed out like a gas that made the ravens want to avoid that area. Definitely texted my coworker after that and asked if we should start making dummy sage grouse that can spray stuff. I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon, but that'd be pretty cool.
Man, I didn't go to Banff that night, but that sounded like quite a film.
It was quite a film.
Okay, we have a couple more questions,
Mm-hmm.
kind of just related to results. So things like, are the management strategies working, and how have their numbers changed since being listed as endangered? And also the rehoming of sage-grouse populations, so moving them from heavily populated to satellite. Yeah, how are all of these various strategies working?
That's a great question. And those are answers that I would love to have. So what we do know is we are getting return on investment in terms of habitat quality from those actions. So we are able to monitor, the amount of grasses and forbs, and able to see that they're dramatically increasing after we install a Z-deck structure in areas, or after we remove cheatgrass using herbicide. We are maintaining native grasses and forbs in those areas. What is really hard to not, and this is like kind of a personal issue, and then also like the issue of the nature of working with a critically threatened species, is that how do we not then tie that to LEC count numbers in the population estimate? And I talked about that cyclical nature of the population itself. It's always been tied to drought and precipitation conditions. It's always fluctuated very dramatically now because of some of these long-term disturbances. So it's very difficult to, when we, invest X amount of money doing this much work in Gunnison, getting this many structures created, and then the next year we don't see an increase in sage grouse. It's pretty difficult to not take that personally. But what we're really hoping for is some long-term change, which we've been blessed with good precipitation the last 2 years. I'm really excited for let counts this year. We're rebounding a little bit. We're trying to create a resilient ecosystem that's able to combat that itself, like these drought changes, and hopefully the birds are able to respond with that. So I'm really hoping that with continued efforts like these, we're going to see more return in the let counts. I'd say right now, the return that we've seen has been more related to precipitation events than it has been from our actions, but that's difficult to prove either way. I think right now it's about being focused, knowing that we're looking at something that's over the span of 100 years, like a system over 100 years, instead of something that's on an annual basis. And with that is the translocation efforts. So this is an ongoing and pretty stressful topic. So Gunnison has all the birds. How many birds are we comfortable taking out of Gunnison, knowing that it's threatened there? They're doing a little bit better, but is it worth taking a bird from Gunnison and putting it somewhere else if it's going to immediately not take that to that new habitat and potentially die? So when we did translocation efforts in around 2010 to 2013, we got some pretty valuable information. And if you saw, most of the satellite populations blinked pretty low, but one really good success story is Poncha Pass. So that is kind of the amazing story of like an unexpected return and continuation of sage grouse. So those were brought in the 2000s, and everyone kind of expected them to blink out because of how small that habitat size is. But we've maintained and even increased a little bit the birds there. So trying to really dial in on what's working and not working. And there's a lot of new strategies. We're pulling from information from greater sage grouse, Colombian sharp-tailed grouse is another grouse that has some somewhat similar behaviors. And basically trying to establish and create best available science for ourselves that says what are different ways that we can translocate where they will actually take to a place and stay there long term. And so that is ongoing, and hopefully by the next time that we're ready to consider translocating, we're more dialed in on those things and we have some more success.
Great. Well, everybody, I think we're going to call it here. Thank you all so much for attending. And Whit, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your passion with us. I hope everybody feels like what I said earlier was true. I think my love for the Gunnison sage-grouse has certainly grown tonight. And I'm looking forward to some of the ways that I'll be involved in protection efforts in the future. You all will be getting an email from me tomorrow with the recording of this webinar. If you'd like to share it with anyone, please feel free. And enjoy your evening, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.